All right, good day, grade 12. Today we are doing the first of the essay questions in chapter 13, which is the effects of tourism on the economy. This is on page 112 of your textbook. Okay, so we are going to look at the effects of tourism on the economy relating to specific aspects of the economy. So the first aspect of the economy that we're going to be looking at is the GDP. What effect does tourism have on the GDP of South Africa? Okay, now you'll think back to one of the previous lessons where I said that the tourist industry is basically service-based. It is a service industry. So obviously the tourist industry is going to impact more on the service industry than, for example, agricultural manufacturing. Right, but although we did say that tourism is a very wide activity. Yes, it is a service industry, but also remember we said part of tourism would be the people that provide the food, the farmers that create the food that is going to be sold at the restaurants to the tourists. It includes, for example, the transport, etc. It's very wide, but most of the components of tourism will fall under the service industry. So obviously its impact in terms of the GDP impact, it's going to impact more on the tertiary sector, which is your service industry, than on agriculture, which is primary sector, or manufacturing, that is secondary sector. All right. Although I did say just now that agriculture does provide food to the restaurants, and the manufacturing industry provides vehicles that are used for transport. The manufacturing industry manufactures the suitcases that are bought by the tourists. There are upstream effects. It does impact on the secondary and the primary sectors as well, but the biggest impact will be on the tertiary sector. Okay, so we say basically that tourism will affect the GDP both directly and indirectly. All right, so when we look at the direct and the indirect and induced contribution that is made by tourism to the GDP, the direct impact would be by the tourist itself, the tourist industries, the public sector, everybody that is directly involved in tourism. Okay, your indirect investment or indirect effect will come from investment that is made by the government or the private sector, as well as purchases from suppliers. Okay, I'm going to explain this in more detail just now. All right. And then the induced benefits to the GDP is spending by direct and indirect employees. So people that are directly involved in the tourist industry will earn a salary. People that are indirectly involved in the tourist industry will earn a salary. And those people are earning salaries purely because of the tourist industry. So the spending, the money that they're earning and spending is part of the induced contribution to the GDP. Right. So the tourist industry itself, near the hotels, the accommodation, the people providing the transport, the restaurants where they purchase things, that will be the direct contribution. Indirect will be the institutions that provide the direct tourist industry with things, like the farmer that provides food to the restaurant. The restaurant will be direct. The farmer providing the food, cultivating the food will be indirect. All right. And then obviously the employees that is paid, their spending will be the induced expenditure. Okay, so there's your explanation. Your direct contribution of travel and tourism is the spending on travel and tourism by residents and non-residents. Remember, we have domestic tourists as well as international tourists. So anybody that is traveling and is qualified as tourism, need at least one night, a maximum 160 kilometers away from their normal environment, they are spending money there on participating in activities, etc., etc. Okay, so any tourist activities by local people, domestic tourists or foreign tourists, any spending of these people, any spending of the tourists on, for example, accommodation, right? The places where they need to stay, the hotels where they're going to stay, the B&Bs, the chalets that they stay in, any accommodation that they pay for, any food that they buy, whether it is at the restaurant, whether it's at the hotel, whether it's at a takeaway place, any food that tourists spend money on, any retail, okay, so stuff that tourists buy, gift shops, the stuff that they buy, the handbags that they buy, the suitcases that they buy, the camera equipment that they buy, anything they buy, curios, anything that they buy Retail is commercial services, buying and selling. Any money that they spend on transport, so their aeroplane tickets, their Uber, what they spend on the Uber, taxis that they might make use of, any transport services that they spend on, and any destination services. So anything that they pay for once they reach their destination. If they're participating in activities and they spend money, for example, they go up Table Mountain, that is going to cost them money. That money is included as the direct contribution. Money spent when tourists are going to Robben Island to see Madiba Sal. That kind of spending will be destination services. If they pay to ride a rickshaw in Durban, that is part of their destination services. Any activities that they are participating in that is costing them money, that spending will be included as part of the direct contribution. Right, from the public sector's side, any spending by the government that is linked directly to visitors. For example, the money that the government will spend on museums or recreational services, parks, the national parks, the upkeep of the Kruger National Park, for example. Right. So direct expenditure is the expenditure of tourists on tourist-related services. Okay, any money that is directly spent by tourists on whatever they spend that money on, that will be the direct contribution. Then the indirect contribution is any spending by people that will supply goods and services to the tourist destinations. All right. So, for example, it will include investment spending by the government and the private sector. For example, when we buy new aircraft, when an airline buys new aircraft to make the traveling for tourists more convenient. The building of new hotels, the building of new resorts, upgrading of water and sanitation. Any investment spending by the government, if they upgrade the roads, if they upgrade the harbors, the airports, that is investment spending that is related to the tourist industry, as well as the private sector. If I decide I'm going to build a new hotel, I'm going to build a new holiday resort, I'm going to build a new restaurant that caters for these tourists. All of these things will be part of the indirect contribution. We are spending money to improve the infrastructure to attract the tourists to come. It's not directly for tourism, it is an indirect contribution. Then it also includes any purchases from suppliers of goods and services from those sectors that deals directly with the tourist. Okay, so for example, when the hotels needs to buy new bedding, they buy the bedding from somebody. Okay, the supplier of the bedding makes an indirect contribution. Those linen are being bought for the tourist industry. Okay, the tourists are not buying the linen, but the hotels are buying the linen so that they can have nice beds and stuff for the tourists when they come. When the hotels buy new beds, when the hotels buy food, they buy the apples from the apple farmer. All of this is an indirect contribution. Okay, you'll see the purchasing of cleaning services by the hotels. The hotel rooms needs to be cleaned. Okay, they will hire it out, the cleaning services, right? Fuel, catering services by the airlines. Somebody supplies them with the food. Travel agents, the services that they provide to get the tourists here. All of that will be an example of the indirect contribution. It's not directly supplying tourists, but it is supplying the tourist destination with stuff that ultimately the tourist is going to spend money on. Right, and then the last one, the induced contribution, that measures the spending of people that are directly or indirectly employed by the travel and tourism industry. Okay, so it's an increase in a consumer spending that results from the income that people are earning through tourism. Okay, so for example, there will be a hotel worker. There's a worker that works at reception. That worker is going to earn a wage or a salary providing a service to the tourist industry, and that hotel worker will use that salary to buy consumer goods and services, to pay his kids' school fees, to buy new shoes for his children, to pay his rent. Okay, and that will be the induced contribution. It's induced because it wouldn't have happened. That spending would not have happened if the worker did not earn an income, and the worker would not earn an income if it wasn't for the tourist industry. Okay, so it's not a direct spending by the tourists, but it's spending because of tourism. All right, now if we look at the actual percentages, our indirect contribution, obviously I said that tourism is a service-based industry, And our service industry is the fastest growing. It's by far, it makes the biggest contribution to the GDP. And by service sector, remember, we mean the tertiary sector. Now, the tertiary sector is by far the biggest contributor to the GDP. In developing economies, if we make a comparison, the tertiary sector is responsible for around 40% of the GDP. And in developed countries, it is responsible for about 65% of the GDP. Now, in South Africa, although we are a developing country, we are not a developed country, but if we looked at the contribution made by the service industry, we see that it's about 67%. That was back in 2011. This percentage isn't changing much. It's 60-something percent. It will be between 60 and 70% of our GDP that is coming from the tourist industry. All right, in terms of the direct contribution, okay, now to really plan for the development of tourist industry, obviously it is important that we know how big the tourist industry is. Now we need to be able to measure the contribution, the direct contribution of tourism to the economy. Now, Statistics South Africa shows us that in 2010, our inbound tourists, in other words, these are foreign tourists from other countries that come into South Africa to travel, they contributed around 69 billion rand. And our domestic tourists, in other words, people traveling around in our own country, contributed about 99 billion. So in total, it was 168 billion, and that represented about 3% of the GDP. And if we literally add the indirect contribution of only tourism, remember here we referred to the entire tertiary sector. This is not only tourism. If we include the indirect contribution of only tourism, it adds about 7% of the GDP. Now, I know it doesn't sound a hell of a lot, but there's very many different industries in our country. And tourism, just one industry, contributes 7% of the GDP. That is quite a significant contribution. And as I said, it is growing. Not at the moment because of COVID, but it generally, the trend is for the contribution of tourism to actually increase over time. Okay, so that is the contribution that tourism makes to the GDP, right? The second aspect of the economy that we're going to look at is employment. Okay, so in other words, what is the contribution that tourism makes to employment, to relieve unemployment in our country? Now, tourism has a major effect on unemployment. You'll see that directly and indirectly, 9% of our employed people were in the tourism industry, either making a direct contribution or an indirect contribution. And in 2011, that amounted to around 1.18 million workers. That is a significant amount of people that are involved in the tourist industry. All right. Now, why is tourism such a big generator of jobs? Now, you'll see that it's the world's largest generator of jobs. So out of all the industries that exist, tourism creates more jobs than any other industry in the world, not just in South Africa. All right. So why is it possible for tourism to create so many jobs? Okay. There's 4 reasons. Okay. First reason there is that tourism is labor intensive. In other words, jobs are being done by people. In the tourist industry, it is not possible for people to be replaced by machinery. It is a labor-intensive industry, which means people are being employed to service the tourists. All right. It has a very low ratio of investment to employment creation. This means that with every unit of capital that is invested, every, let's say, 100 rand or whatever, a certain amount of money is invested in tourism, a lot of jobs can be created. Okay, so we don't need, in other words, a very high amount of capital investment. We don't need a lot of money to be invested in order to create jobs. All right, like for example in manufacturing, in order to create jobs in manufacturing, we first have to build a factory. There has to be a money expenditure, a large expenditure to build a factory before we can employ workers. But in the case of tourism, that is not always necessary. With a small amount of capital invested, we are able to create quite a few jobs. All right, which means that many tourist activities are within the reach of small operators. It's not only people that has a large amount of money to invest that can get involved in tourism. Small little people, small entrepreneurs with a small amount of capital is able to get involved in tourism because it doesn't need a huge investment. So it's easier for people to get involved in tourism. So jobs can be created relatively easily and relatively cheaply. Right. Then the tourist industry also employs many different skills. All right. Because the tourist industry is so very, very wide, it's an extremely wide industry. It caters for almost any skill in the tourist industry. If you think from accountants, hotels obviously need to manage their finances, right? So they need accountants to make sure to balance the books, hairdressers, tour guides, trackers to track the animals. The tourist industry, there's multiple skills, dancing, cultural activities. People want to go to the hotel, they want to see Zulu dancing. So people that has a skill of dancing, it creates a job for those people. All right. So it's very skills based. Okay, and you don't have to have extremely high levels of skills. You don't need to have a university degree and an honors degree and a doctor's degree to get involved in the tourist industry. People can get involved into tourism with no qualifications at all, as long as they have a skill that is valuable in the tourist industry. Plus, the potential for on-the-job training is significant. You don't need a qualification. We train you on the job. We employ an unskilled worker. We show you how it works. We show you what we want you to do. So the potential for on-the-job training is significant. So what is important is that it creates jobs for those vulnerable people in the economy, the people that don't necessarily have skills, that find it very difficult to find a job in any other industry. Okay. Then tourism can also provide immediate employment. Okay, so it's not a question of it's going to take us 10 years to provide employment. Within a short amount of time, we are able to create quite a few jobs. All right, so the example there, if 1/4 of tourist accommodation establishments, the hotels, the B&Bs or whatever, the accommodation people, if only 1/4 of them starts to offer live entertainment, okay, whether it's people just playing live music, entertainers, people playing live music on a Friday night, offering Zulu dances around the campfire, etc., etc. If they start to offer live entertainment, thousands of entertainers could be employed within days. Okay, we don't need a huge capital investment. We just say, okay, well, every weekend we are going to provide live entertainment, and thousands of different entertainers, singers, dancers, magicians, anybody can get a jobs almost instantly, within a couple of days. And then last reason why it's so suitable to create a lot of jobs is that tourism provides entrepreneurial opportunities. The tourist industry lends itself to entrepreneurial opportunities, okay, both in the formal and the informal sector, but mostly in the informal sector, because remember I said it is skills based. You don't need a large amount of capital. So it can accommodate informal sector opportunities, arts and crafts. People working with their hands, they are very creative. They make arts and crafts, fruit vendors, pavement vendors, on the beach, people rent out chairs and umbrellas, etc., etc. Okay, it opens opportunities for a small entrepreneur with a small amount of money and a small investment to start a business of his own and then obviously employ other people. Okay. Now, many economists believe that the multiplier in the tourist industry is even bigger. The multiplier effect on tourism is bigger than, for example, government spending. Okay, because remember, tourism to a large extent does bring injections into the country, especially when it's foreign tourism. All right. This is because your tourist spending happens through so many, many different sources. It's not just one thing that people are spending money on, right? They spend on accommodation, they spend on food and beverages, they shop at our retailers, they buy curios, they buy gifts, they pay for entertainment, they pay for transport. It provides income for the hotel staff, anybody that's directly, indirectly involved in the tourist industry, the suppliers of goods and services. It just affects so many, many different industries that jobs can be created in many, many different industries. Jobs are created at hotels and other forms of accommodation. Jobs are created by restaurants and shops and entertainers and transport, taxi drivers, hotel staff, the cleaners, the receptionists, the cooks in the kitchen, the waiters in the restaurants, taxi operators, shopkeepers, the farmers. They can employ more farm workers because they are planting more stuff because we need to supply the restaurants with food for the tourists. Okay, so the focus in tourism currently is for the government to focus on the potential of entrepreneurship. All right, because we have such a high level of unemployment in the country, we want to focus on supporting small little entrepreneurs so that we can create jobs for historically disadvantaged people. And then marginalized people can get involved and reap the benefits of tourism as well. Okay, the third aspect of the economy that we are going to be paying attention to is poverty. Okay, so what effect does tourism have on poverty? All right, obviously this relates very much to employment. Okay, we just said that many, hundreds of thousands of people are employed directly or indirectly in the tourist industry, right? So there are lots of members of households that are earning an income as a result of their involvement in the tourist industry, either directly or indirectly. And when people are able to earn an income, obviously that reduces the level of poverty. More people earning an income means that there's less people living in poverty. All right. The DTI, if you don't know, you must write it down. The DTI stands for the Department of Trade and Industry. Okay, so the Department of Trade and Industry is involved in many poverty relief projects that promotes the development of community-owned tourism. So the focus is not just only on the fancy hotels and the fancy resorts, whatever. It's part of their strategy to make sure that marginalized people also have access to the opportunities that is offered by the tourist industry. All right. So they facilitate also the establishment of tourist infrastructure. What is very important, the tourists obviously will go to the areas where there's infrastructure. Tourists generally can't go to a place when the roads are falling apart. Tourists don't go to destinations where there's no running water or sanitation or the electricity supply. Tourists likes to have a comfortable kind of experience, all right? So obviously the most of the poverty-stricken areas will be in our underdeveloped areas, the rural areas, where infrastructure might be lacking. All right, so basically the government, the Department of Trade and Industry, makes sure that these rural areas will receive the infrastructure that is necessary to bring the tourists to the area so that the local people can also then reap the benefits of tourism. Okay, tourism is seen as one of the fastest and most effective redistribution mechanisms in development. All right, because it is a growing industry, because it is so easy to get involved in the tourist industry, it is seen as a very effective way of redistributing income by creating opportunities, by encouraging people to get involved in this tourist industry so that they can reap the benefits of it. All right, as I already said, tourism brings development to the poor in the rural areas. As I said, a lot of the tourist attractions in our country, if you think in terms of the big five, at game reserves, those things are not in the cities, they are in the rural areas. All right, so many of our tourist attractions are not necessarily found in the city centers, they are found in the rural areas. So because tourists then go into the rural areas to experience these tourist attractions, these poor people in the rural areas can benefit from tourism. All right, in many cases, the rural areas rely on tourism as their main source of income. Okay, in many cases, they don't have other sources of reliable income really. All right, so development normally takes place around these tourist attractions, which means that rural people then have the opportunity to sell curios, to sell, to be an entertainer, whatever, to use whatever skills they have to provide services to the tourist industry when the tourist comes to their areas. And obviously that will provide us with a sustainable form of development. We are giving local people access to a job, access to share in the benefits of tourism. Okay, so basically tourism provides an alternative to urbanization. A lot of people, because there's more poverty in the rural areas, people decide to move to the cities. Okay, there's a lot of people that leave the rural areas to the cities. Remember, we did speak about this in chapter 11 about urbanization, where the population in the cities are becoming very big and the cities are becoming overcrowded. So instead of people coming into the city for opportunities, we create an opportunity for them in the rural areas. Now, if we can create opportunities for especially women and young people in the rural areas, there's no need for them to move into the city to try and come and find a job because there isn't enough jobs for everybody. They think they're going to have a better life in the cities and they don't always because there's just not enough jobs. There's more jobs, yes, but there's not enough jobs for everybody. All right. So it does provide an alternative to urbanization where people can remain in the rural areas and we bring the opportunities to them in the rural areas. They don't have to move to the city and be uprooted and change their lifestyle. They can stay where they are, and we bring the opportunities to them. All right. So how does tourism offer opportunities for income for the poor people? How does it create an income and relieve poverty in the rural areas? First of all, by allowing them a stake. Okay, a stake means ownership. All right, a share. A stake is basically a share. We are allowing them to have a share in the tourist industry by, for example, to start a small-scale tourist business. All right. So if there is, for example, a national park, Kruger National Park, local people can receive training and they can become tour guides in the park. They learn about the animals, whatever they tell people. All right. Or they open a small little curio shop where they sell local stuff, arts and crafts, things that the local people are able to make with their skills, with their creativity. All right. So we are giving them an opportunity to open a business, basically, in the tourist industry. All right. We are also empowering them, okay, in order to give them the opportunity to exploit opportunities. Remember, I said tourism lends itself to on-the-job training. All right. When you build a new hotel in South Africa, I think it's at Josini. The area is called Josini. There is a hotel. It's the Tiger Fishing Lodge. Okay. At the Tiger Fishing Lodge, there's signs all over the hotel where they literally say that not everybody in the hotel, working in the hotel, are qualified to work in the hotel industry. They don't have degrees and qualifications to work in the hotel industry. There are key people in the hotel, like the head chef, for example, would have a qualification, right? But what they do is they pride themselves on the fact that they employ people from the local area around Josini, which is very, very poor. It's a very poor area. And the schools are few and far apart. The people there don't have an education, right? So when the hotel was built, they made a point of not importing all these qualified people from Gauteng and wherever the city is. They employ people from the rural area that has no skills, and they do on-the-job training, right? They take them into the kitchens, like this is the head chef. This head chef is going to teach you everything he knows, and people get taught. They receive on-the-job training. It removes them out of their poverty. Now they're learning, they're getting a skill, plus they're earning an income that can support their family. All right. And all of this is as a result of tourism. The hotel wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the tourism that came to the area. All right. So we are empowering people by providing them with on-the-job training. We are giving them a skill that makes it possible for them then to become more employable. All right. And then lastly, it also can create partnerships, okay, when there's a linking up with mainstream tourist businesses that supplies goods and services. So they will, a big hotel, for example, will source their food from a small little local farmer. All right. So the small little local farmer, his business will start booming because he's supplying the hotel. The hotel is booming because of tourism. All right. So by your formal sector, mainstream tourist businesses partnering up with smaller businesses, new businesses, smaller entrepreneurs, whatever, it gives them the opportunity also to grow. Okay, it gives them a bigger share in the tourist industry. All right, and that is it for poverty. Okay, the next aspect of the economy that tourism can affect positively or negatively is investment. Okay, in terms of investment. So how does tourism affect investments in the country? All right. As I said just now, we need basic infrastructure in order for tourists to come. All right. So all of our tourist destination areas, the areas that the tourists tend to visit, those areas need an adequate supply of physical, economic, and basic infrastructure. All right. Which means that the government obviously needs to invest. Tourists, as I mentioned, does not want to go to an area where they can't have running water. All right, they are used to coming there from their country, there in Europe, where running water is not a problem. They're used to having access to water and sanitation on demand, electricity when they need it. So the necessary infrastructure must be there. Tourists are not going to go into an area if the relevant infrastructure is not available. All right, which means that we need to do investment in transport infrastructure, communications infrastructure, energy, electricity, and basic services. All right. So in terms of transport infrastructure, That will include roads, okay, which includes your national roads, but it also includes little streets, local streets in Krugersdorp, for example, pavements for people to walk on, railway lines, airports, harbours, car parks. All of those are part of transport infrastructure. Obviously, the tourist needs to be able to get to their destination. If they can't get to their destination, the destination is not going to exist. Tourists are not going to come. All right. So transport infrastructure is necessary for us to bring the tourists where they need to be. Okay, if the tourist attraction is there far away in the rural area, we need to invest in transport infrastructure and build a road that goes to that remote area. Okay, in terms of communication infrastructure, this will include telephone lines, okay, electronic signal stations, Wi-Fi signals, computer connections, radio and television services, newspapers, any kind of communication. All right. The most important communications infrastructure would be telephone lines and obviously data. People need access to Wi-Fi. When the tourists come, they still need to communicate to their family back home. All right, I don't know about you, but I mean, if you go anywhere, your parents want to know that you have arrived safely. All right. So if tourists come to South Africa, they need to somehow communicate to their family in their country that they have arrived safely. They would like to speak to them once in a while to tell them what a wonderful time they're having, etc., etc. So it's very important that they're able to communicate. Okay, starting with the booking. Right, if they want to come to your hotel, they need to be able to contact the hotel to make a booking. All right, so there has to be the relevant infrastructure for them in order to communicate. Energy infrastructure, electricity and liquid fuels. As I said, they don't want to go in the middle of nowhere where they don't have access to electricity. They want to be able to charge their devices. They want to access to a Wi-Fi signal. They want to be able to see what they're doing at night and cook their food, etc., etc. So they need access to a proper and reliable electricity infrastructure. And then in terms of basic services, that is, for example, as I mentioned, clean water on demand. I know in Cape Town back in the day, they don't have the problem anymore. But when there was those severe water shortages in the Western Cape, the tourist industry took a huge hit. Nobody wanted to go there because a tourist, after a day on the beach or going sightseeing, they want to lie in a hot bath and they want to enjoy their bubble bath to get clean. When they want to drink water, it has to be there. They don't want to be told, I'm sorry, I can't wash your towels every day because we don't have water. They want clean towels every day. All right. So there has to be a reliable source of clean water and enough clean water. Refuse removal. They don't want to live in their own garbage. Refuse needs to be removed. They want to create garbage and not even know that it's there. Sanitary services. Flushing the toilet and the chachis goes away, right? Basic services they take for granted. They have it in their country. They want to have it when they come here. Okay. I've already given you an example of where a lack of adequate basic services will prevent growth in tourism. As I said, Cape Town itself, it saw a huge drop in tourism when they had severe water restrictions. Okay, tourists want to come and have a comfortable holiday. They want to have a comfortable holiday. They want to have access to these basic things that they have access to. All right. Now, these basic infrastructure, it is not something that generates an income. All right. So it is something that the government provides that they don't necessarily receive an income for. All right. It is necessary to bring the tourists, but it doesn't necessarily earn an income. All right. And what is a big problem in tourism is the seasonality. All right. So we are basically providing infrastructure to an area where the tourists are going to visit for 3 months a year. Okay, the rest of the 9 months, it's really quiet. All right. So when we invest in this infrastructure, when we develop the infrastructure, it is important that the construction of the infrastructure is planned to meet the percentage of the peak. All right. So it has to be finished, in other words, by the time that it is the peak season. All right. So we have to make sure that we provide before the people actually come. All right. And then the importance of different transport infrastructure is also shown by the different modes of transport used by different tourists. Okay. By far, the largest number of tourists will travel by road within the country now. Okay. Within the country, people travel by road. Okay. So a road network is extremely important. Rail and sea travelers, okay, that's a lot smaller. The numbers are really much smaller. Obviously, the foreign tourist needs to arrive here first, okay, and that will happen like with air travel, for example. Okay, but once they are here, they travel around by road. Okay, they want to rent a car or they go with a bus or a taxi or Uber or whatever. But most of the transporting around of the tourists will happen in terms of road transport. And a spin-off of providing infrastructure, when the government invests in infrastructure, when there is, for example, a tourist attraction in a rural area, and the government decides, right, we need to provide running water, we need to provide sanitation, it is not only the tourists that are going to benefit from this. Yes, the tourists are going to have access to the roads and the sanitation and everything when they are here, but when the tourists go back home, we don't roll up the road and pack it away. We don't put the sanitation in a box and pack it away. Local communities have access to this infrastructure as well as the tourists. So it doesn't only benefit the tourists. We have the infrastructure to bring the tourists, but our local communities will actually benefit from having access to this infrastructure as well. Infrastructure they might not have had if it wasn't for the tourist attraction. Okay. And then the next thing we're going to look at is externalities. Go after chapter 8, you know all about externalities. Well, those of you that have been attending school knows everything about externalities, right? Remember we said externalities are costs or benefits of one person's decision that spills over to other people. It's side effects of certain things. One person does something and other people will either benefit or be disadvantaged by one person's actions or decisions. All right. So how does the tourist industry create externalities? Okay, now what is very important here is that the tourist industries can have both positive and negative externalities. All right, now and into the future. All right, and there's your definition. Externalities are costs or benefits that arise from economic activities that are not reflected in the actual prices of transactions. That is what we focused on in chapter 8. The fact that the market is failing because the benefits or the costs of a decision is not taken into consideration. So the actual price of tourism doesn't include the positive or the negative externalities that it causes. Okay, now we all agree that tourism does attract large amounts of revenue. We've seen how much money tourists are spending here on accommodation, on transport, and buying curios and gifts and entertainment and whatever. So yes, it does create a large amount of revenue, but it also causes environmental damage. All right, and that is a negative externality. All right, like any other economic activities, tourists use resources. The more tourists we have, the more water we are going to use. Water is a scarce resource. The more tourists we have, the more people there are, the more waste we are going to produce. All right. So obviously we are using our resources. We might be using resources faster than what we can recreate them, which will create environmental damage. We produce waste, pollution that is causing environmental damage. All right. So it also creates environmental, social, and cultural costs and benefits in the process. Okay. Now, when there's growth in the tourist industry, there's short-term benefits. Okay. Obviously, because of the revenue that it earns and the jobs that it's creating and the poverty that it's relieving, there are definitely short-term benefits. Okay. But if tourism grows very, very fast, okay, and it grows in an unsustainable and unmanaged way, it usually results in more negative than positive effects. Okay. It can include, now I referred to cultural costs and benefits. It can mean that there's a degeneration of traditions and cultural values, and then environmental damage. Okay. Now, degeneration of traditions and culture because our rural communities are now exposed to tourists, a westernized way of living. All right. Where our people in our more remote areas might still live according to tradition. They've got cultural values, certain, their own language, etc., etc. The more they get exposed to tourists, the more we have a risk of them actually losing their traditions and cultures. All right, because they get exposed to a different way of living and they might decide, well, that way of living is better. All right. So it does mean that we can lose our tradition, our cultural identities through exposure to many tourists from different countries. We become too westernized. African cultures become very westernized. All right, which is a loss. It's a cultural loss to the country. All right. Obviously, damage, environmental damage to sites and natural areas. Okay, we see this every year when domestic tourists go down to the coast. They have one big massive party on the beach. The next day, there's rubbish all over the beach. There's glass bottles that have broken. There's plastic all over. It's waste, human waste, solid waste, packagings and stuff that people are just leaving behind, and we are polluting natural areas. All right. So any pollution and waste that is generated by tourists will be a negative externality. It's doing damage to the environment. Okay. For example, also when people go diving on reefs, okay, under the sea, those reefs, as soon as a person touches the reef, that part of the reef actually dies. All right. So the more divers go to dive the reef, and the more people touch the reef, and the more people remove little things off the reef to take with them, when they go back to their house, it creates damage. Natural areas are destroyed in the process. Okay. Then the transport of tourists also, major source of environmental impact, because most of transport happens on fossil fuels, right? The burning of petrol, the creation of petrol, the burning of oil, fossil fuels, it creates a huge amount of air pollution, which has a huge environmental impact. Okay, so with the rapid growth in population, improving living standards, increasing free time, remember all those reasons for the increase in tourism, we are expecting tourism to even grow even more in the future. All right. So over the next 2 decades, we expect that there will be even more people that are looking for holiday destinations away from their own country. International tourism is on the increase, as I said in the beginning of this chapter, because people are earning more money, people have more free time, more people can afford to travel internationally. So there's more and more people that are participating in foreign tourism, that are traveling to foreign destinations away from their own country. Right. And as a result of this expansion, obviously popular tourist sites is going to be faced with increased pressure on their resources. Okay. Now we know tourism attracts revenue, we know it reduces poverty, we know that it can create jobs, and it can lead to the conservation of our cultural and natural assets because we preserve them because it brings the tourists. But if we don't plan this thing properly, it can actually mean that we lose our cultural diversity and we become too westernized. We lose our natural assets because we don't look after them, and we allow it to be destroyed in the process. Okay, so what are the benefits of tourism? Okay, we're going to look more about the planning. At the very, very end of this chapter, we're going to look at what is the government going to do now? How can we make our tourist industry more sustainable? How can we plan it better so that we can eliminate these negative externalities? All right. So what are the benefits of tourism? Okay, we already spoke about the creation of employment. We know tourist industry creates a huge amount of jobs, specifically in the service industry. We benefit from the infrastructure that the government invests in. The building of the hotels, roads, sanitation, water. People in rural areas will have access to infrastructure that was built for the tourists, to bring the tourists, but our local people get the benefit of that infrastructure as well. Okay, it helps us to develop and maintain our rural areas. As I said, we develop our rural areas to bring the tourists there. It increases the demand for our local food, the arts and crafts, whatever. It creates job opportunities and income for local communities. And then our local people enjoy increasing wealth. They have the better public healthcare system, the infrastructure that they have access to. They benefit from having clean beaches. It's aimed at the tourists, but nobody's stopping the local people to go to the beaches as well. They benefit from the cultural exchanges with tourists. Okay, remember I said this can be a disadvantage as well, right? But they get exposed to tourists. They can chat to the tourists. They talk about, they share knowledge basically, so they can benefit from their interaction with the tourists as well. Right, but on the negative side, it can lead to more inequality. It depends on how we manage tourism. Okay, at the end of the chapter, we're going to look at this again. Okay, if rural people don't get the benefits, of tourism, if tourists tends to go to the fancy hotels and the cities or whatever, if you're already big conglomerates are benefiting from tourism more, and we don't give rural people a chance to participate in the tourist industry, it can actually mean that it's going to create even more inequality. All right. So it's important that we manage it in such a way that we don't create more inequalities or make inequalities worse. All right. Then it does cause local prices to increase as well. Okay, that is very unfortunate because tourists, as a result of our very weak currency, for them, they are able to pay higher prices because their currencies are so much stronger than ours. So at the tourist destinations, very often the prices of goods and services are increased in the peak seasons so that businesses can make a lot of money from the tourists who are able to pay these high prices. And unfortunately, local people, they don't get the benefit of having these goods and services. We can't afford to pay for the goods and services. All right. To go up Table Mountain, for example, extremely expensive. To go to Robben Island, extremely expensive because they are catering for the tourists who can afford to pay those higher prices. So us local people, we don't get to experience our own heritage because we can't afford those prices. Okay. High levels of tourism can also lead to traffic congestion. More people, more cars on the roads, more pollution, more litter, more CO2 emissions because we transport them around, more water consumption, more crime. Okay, because our local people are also, involved in crime when it comes to the tourists. Tourists gets robbed. People know that the tourists are walking around with fancy cameras and fancy phones or whatever, so they are a target. So it does increase our crime rate as well in terms of theft and because they target the tourist industry. Okay, so there's a lot of negative consequences that comes along with tourism. Okay, it can also change the appearance of a community where it could have maybe been a pristine natural environment, and now we go and we build a fancy hotel in the middle and we destroy the natural environment through building the hotel there. Okay, so a number of countries now, and as I said, we're going to talk about it at the end of this chapter, we want to achieve ethical and sustainable tourism. Okay, so that what is ethical is it is tourism that will respect the traditions and customs of the area. So they're not looking towards changing the area, the local community's traditions and customs. It is about respecting our local traditions and customs. And we are looking to plow back some of its earnings into the local community rather than inflicting environmental damage. So we're wanting local communities and the environment and everything to benefit from tourism. In other words, we want to increase the benefits of tourism and try and eliminate the negative externalities that come as a result of tourism. Right, so it must be conducted in such a way that we protect the area as an attractive tourist destination so that it can be a tourist destination now and it can still be a tourist destination into the future. We don't want to destroy it now so that in the future it doesn't exist anymore. All right, so it is important that we develop a tourist strategy so that we can see exactly how. What is our strategy? How are we going to make sure that we can maximize the benefits of tourism and minimize the negative externalities? And that we are going to look at the end of the chapter. Okay, the last thing for this lesson is we're going to look at the environmental effects. Most of this I have mentioned now already. So what impact does tourism have on the environment? All right. So as I said, any form of industrial development obviously impacts on the physical environment. The more hotels we build, the more resorts we build, the more shops we build, the more roads we have to build over mountains and stuff. We are changing the physical environment. We are interfering with the physical environment where industrial development takes place. The natural environment is basically destroyed in order to create industrial development. Okay. Now, tourism as an industry, tourists as such, they have to physically visit the place of production, the destination, in order for tourism to happen. It means that people have to go to a destination. All right. So it's not something that they can do at their own house. All right. Tourism is an industry that requires that people go to the area where the tourism is going to take place. So inevitably, going to a travel destination, traveling to your destination, spending time at the destination, participating in activities there, inevitably, it is going to have an impact on the environment at the destination. Okay, so tourism does create environmental stress. Okay, the four main stress activities is permanent environmental restructuring. As I said, we are changing the natural landscape. When we are building infrastructure, we build a highway through a mountain pass, right? We build an airport, we build a harbor there by the sea, we build a resort. We are destroying nature permanently when we build infrastructure. All right, secondly, we generate waste, okay? both biological and non-biological waste. Plastic, more plastic gets dumped in the environment. Human waste, right? And that can cause health hazard. It does destroy the environment. The more plastic waste we dump into the environment, the more damage we are doing to the environment. The fish production, the fish species, it's big now. The fish eat the plastic, the turtles are dying, the dolphins are dying, fishes are dying because their water's polluted. The ocean is so polluted that that there's less oxygen for the fishes to breathe or whatever. So the waste that people are generating, the more people there are, the more waste is going to be generated, and the waste has to be disposed of in some way. All right. Then there's direct environmental stress caused by tourist activities. As I said, the destruction of the coral reefs. When you go diving under the sea, people want to touch the reefs, or they're inexperienced, they don't know how to dive properly, and they land smack dam on the reef. That piece of the reef, as soon as we touch it, it dies. Okay? And it cannot regenerate itself just from instantly. There's no medicine to fix it. It's dead forever. Okay? People remove stuff. They want to pick up a shark tooth there off the reef. They want to take a shell. They want to take things. And if every single person that goes there takes an item, there is going to be nothing left, right? The vegetation on the dunes, okay, on the beaches. This is why in our country it is now illegal to drive on the beaches, because there's forever macho tourist men that now who needs to see whose 4x4 bucky can climb this dune, and they go up and down the dunes. They destroy the vegetation, the plant life on the dunes. It's dead forever. They drive over the turtles that's walking over the beach to go and lay their eggs. That is direct environmental stress that is caused by tourists because they are in an area where humans actually don't belong. All right. And then lastly, it has an effect on population dynamics as well. Okay, so migration, increased urban densities, okay, which means urbanization. More people in the cities and less people in rural areas. It's changing the demographics of the population. It's changing the spread of the population in the different areas of the country. So cities and urban areas become overpopulated. There isn't enough infrastructure for everybody. There isn't enough food, water, sanitation, nothing for everybody. And then the population in the rural areas are declining. Okay, nobody wants to be there. All right. So how does tourism benefit the environment? Okay, we do use sometimes tourism as a reason for conservation. There are certain areas in our country that we protect because it is a tourist destination. All right. Our World Heritage Sites, for example, it's international tourist attraction, and there are strict rules that apply. Okay, the Kruger National Park, for example, it's a conservation area. They restrict how many people are able to go in there on any given day. There is no hunting. There is no feeding of animals, for example. They are protecting the area to preserve it intact so that future generations can also come and see it. So we use tourism as a reason to protect the environment, so that tourists can come. Okay, so it means that there's better protection of rare plants and animals because it brings the tourists. We protect the rhino, not very well. We are trying to protect the rhino. We're not very successful from poaching, right? But we protect the rhino because we know people are coming to South Africa to see the big five. If the rhino is no longer there, it's a big four. They want to come and see the big five, not the big four. So we protect animals and plants because it brings the tourists here. All right. And then tourism also provides educational opportunities to learn about the protection of the environment. Many cases, people don't appreciate the environment because of ignorance. They don't realize the importance of the environment. So when we can educate them about how important the environment is, it leads to more people actually protecting and caring about the environment. Okay, on the negative side, greenhouse gas emissions. More people, more transport, more fossil fuels being burnt, more gas emissions, which is damaging to air pollution, damaging to the environment. Increase in demand for water, especially in the areas where there's shortages of water. Okay, it can lead to water shortages and people not having access to water because the more people there are, the more water we consume. Right? We have spoken about increased traffic, okay, in conservation areas. So the more people there are, obviously the more traffic congestion there's going to be. And that lowers the quality of life for our local people. Local people would like to just quickly zip to the shops. But because of tourism, there's traffic congestion. And what's normally a 5-minute trip turns into a 1-hour trip because they're stuck in traffic, right? So it does have a negative influence. And remember, all the time where there's traffic congestion, fossil fuels are being burnt and we are creating greenhouse gas emissions. All right. An overload of construction and development projects for tourism can also damage cultural resources. Okay, we're losing land. We are physically using land to build a hotel. So the animals that used to live on the land, they are gone. They have to move away because the construction is going to chase them away. We can't have animals living on the same land as people. All right, so it's destroying the environment when we develop land in order for the tourists to build a hotel or a resort or whatever. Okay, there's noise pollutions in neighborhoods close to the airports. The more tourists there are, the more transport there are, the more planes are landing. Obviously, that creates noise pollution for the neighbors of the airports. The depletion of fish stocks, okay, that's also a big thing. Okay, our fishing resources in South Africa is under severe pressure because people go to the coast. Part of the experience, I must eat fish. Now we are in the Cape Town now, we have to eat fish. The more fish we demand to eat, the more fish they have to catch. And obviously, our fishing resources already are under pressure. It's a resource that we potentially can exploit to extinction. Okay, if we eat it all up faster than what they can regenerate, we are not going to have fish. All right. I spoke about the air pollution and the traffic jams. I've spoke about the traffic congestion. We did say that tourism creates additional waste and litter, both human waste and just litter that has to be disposed of. Okay, destroys forested areas. And if we build a road over a pristine natural area, it destroys the environmental, like the face of the environment forever. Okay, we did mention all of this. Right, and then tourist wants to ride boats in a quiet lagoon. They want to drive their beach buggies on the dunes. I did explain this. People drive over the dunes. They destroy the vegetation. They drive over the turtles. The turtles die. Again, it is a resource that potentially we can destroy. All right. When people want to ride in their motorboat with their big engines or those wet bikes, whatever, and they're driving up and down, other people want to sit quietly on the beach and enjoy the sounds of the waves. And now you have people driving up and down in their boats, making one hell of a noise. Okay, it is disturbing to the people that wants the peace and quiet. All right, that's the end of this lesson. It is quite a long one. Remember, this is an essay question.